Well, good morning once again. I welcome you back to Studio B, the basement studio, where we are continuing our adventure in the Gospel of John. We continue in chapter 3 today. We started into the second half of chapter 3 last week, and today we're going to pick up with where we left off then. I trust that this finds you well, and I hope that you're excited about the opportunity to gain some new insights into the Gospel of John and what we can learn about Jesus in his mission of showing us the Father, because that is the central focus of this record. So let's recall what we went over last week. At this point, this follows the encounter with Nicodemus, which was the first half of chapter 3 in the book of John. And after we leave Nicodemus behind, we move back out into the Judean countryside, and essentially we see the ministries of John and the ministry of Jesus sort of coexisting, looking in some ways quite similar, because we learn at this point that Jesus' ministry is also baptizing. His disciples are baptizing. So John's baptizing in one location. Jesus and his disciples are baptizing in another location. And it appears that this put those two camps into a little bit of tension. The question is raised whether there might have been some competition felt between the two groups, or even a rivalry, or, as we discussed last week, perhaps even a little bit of jealousy, particularly on the part of John's disciples that were out there in the wilderness. We spent quite a bit of time last week talking about the fact that John the Baptist himself was always consistently pointing to Jesus, but that his disciples here had continued to follow him, and they seemed to be reluctant or perhaps even opposed to going over and joining Jesus. We also talked about, we reminded ourselves last week of some of the tremendous differences in the way those two ministries looked. So the reality was that people were a bit confused, it seems, as far as how these two ministries related to one another. And so as we divide this section up, here are the four sections of the text that we will be looking at. Last week we took a look at chapter 3 verses 22 through 26 and talking about the situation that was existing. And of course you'll recall that the situation was that there had been a bit of a controversy that had broken out relating to purification or ceremonial cleansing. Perhaps even asking that specific question is, okay, Jesus' group is baptizing and John's group is baptizing. Which baptism should I get in line with? There's a good chance that that was actually the question that was under consideration there. Today we're going to pick up here with verses 27 through 30, where the Baptist responds to that question that's brought to him by his disciples. Then we will take a look at the end of chapter 3 in verses 31 through 36, where it appears that the author, John the Apostle, summarizes what he has observed and what he learned from these particular encounters. And then in the beginning of chapter 4, we see some of the impact on particularly the ministry of Jesus relating to what's going on out in the Judean countryside or the Judean wilderness. So today we pick up with chapter 3, verses 27 through 30. And I just want to remind you, before we go into 27 through 30, I want to remind you of verse 26, where John's disciples come to John, and the Bible says they came to John and said to him, "Rabbi," or teacher, "that man who was with you on the other side of the Jordan," of course that's referring to Jesus, "the one you testified about, well, he's baptizing and everyone is going to him." Okay, and so there's this sense of at least a rivalry and perhaps even a bit of jealousy on the part of John's disciples. Last week we spent a long time talking about reasons that people go so far in their conversion experience, but they don't complete it. And quite often we can find ourselves trapped in the same boat where we find ourselves converted in a false way to some things that aren't really going to continue to hold us as we mature and grow in Christ. And so we have to be open to the transition, to making the transition fully from being an unbeliever to a completely devoted disciple of Jesus. Okay, and that's the process actually that this chapter is all about, because that's what Jesus was trying to teach Nicodemus in the first half of the chapter when he said, you must be born again from above. And so he was emphasizing this requires a total change and a total transformation. Okay, so that's where we find ourselves today, and we're going to pick up right now with verse 27 in chapter 3, and let's read this next section, which is the Baptist's response to that question on the part of his disciples. Well, what about Jesus and his ministry, the fact that he's baptizing too and everybody's going over to him? What do you have to say about that, John? Verse 27, to this John replied, a man can receive only what is given him from heaven. You yourselves can testify that I said, I am not the Christ, but am sent ahead of him. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must become greater, I must become less. And this is John's response and reaction. And this shouldn't sound new to us because this is what John has been claiming all along. But let's begin to break this down. John's response begins by saying, a man can receive only what is given him from heaven. And in saying this, John is really saying one has to accept the role God gives one. You can't accomplish something that God hasn't put you in a position or given you the resources to do. You can only do what God ordains to be put in your path. I'm only able to do what God makes possible. One has to learn to accept what God gives you, what opportunities God places in your way. And this applies to a lot of things. It applies to our role and our responsibility in the kingdom. You can't be something you're not prepared or in a position to do. It depends on your experience. What experiences has God placed in your life? And what talents has he given you? What resources has he given you to accomplish those things? Well, the bottom line is we must learn to agree with John and just simply take responsibility and manage those things that God places in our path. So in this situation, the Baptist is realizing he has not been given the same gifts that Jesus was given. He has not been given the same responsibilities that Jesus was given. But nonetheless, John found a great satisfaction, a great fulfillment in this secondary role that he had. Okay? And so when John replies and says a man can only receive what is given him from heaven, it's pointing out that this is the responsibility and the role God has laid on him. He can't do what he's not empowered and in a position to do. God has given him a very specific niche, and it's his intention to fulfill that niche. And boy, oh boy, what a lesson that should be for us. Finding our niche and then stepping in and taking it and running with it. What a great, and we're going to talk about that later this morning in some more detail. But that's what verse 27 has to say. And then in verse 28, John reminds them of something that he had always said. The Baptist says, you yourselves can testify because you've heard me say it before, that I have said, I have always said, I am not the Christ, but am sent ahead of him. Now what's remarkable about this is that the author, as he records this, doesn't just give the response that we might be tempted to say, where the Baptist just simply says again, I am not the Christ. But the author says, no, I've been saying this all along. I didn't just start saying it. And why is that important? Well, it's important because John needs them to understand that this has always been his role. He's not just reacting to the fact that Jesus is now becoming more popular than he is. If that were the case, then he would not have said, I've always told you this. This is the way it's always been. This is the way it's going to be. This is the role God has given me. And so John has seen this role from the beginning, and the Apostle John records that so that we can be sure that the Baptist is not just crying sour grapes because his ministry is being upstaged by that of Jesus, okay? But no, John the Baptist says it's always been this way, all right? You yourselves can testify that I have always said, I am not the Christ, but I am sent ahead of him. So this shows us the author, John the Apostle, the meticulous detail that he is presenting to us, because he wants us to understand that this was not just a transient reaction on the part of the Baptist, but this was the plan from the beginning and the role he saw for himself from the time he began his ministry. Then in verse 29, we begin this metaphor of a wedding. And of course, the metaphor is about the groom and the bride. And Jesus, of course, is the groom in this situation, and he has the bride. The groom's friend is the Baptist, okay? And so the Baptist is simply saying, I find my happiness in the groom's well-being, and in the groom's mission, and in the groom's receiving his bride. And so that is what the Baptist is pointing out. He's pointing out that my fulfillment, my happiness, and even he goes so far as to say my joy is based upon Jesus fulfilling his mission and his role. And so this is fascinating that John's emotional maturity shows that he's not just simply resigned to God's role. He's not just simply filling that role because that's what he had to do and that's his job. And he doesn't feel slighted in the least, but rather he feels full of joy. Listen again to verse 29. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend, that's me, John the Baptist, the friend, John, who attends the bridegroom, waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine. That's the joy that I am experiencing, says the Baptist, and it is now complete. The mission is being fulfilled. It is now being completed. It is now mature. So John's emotion is one of joy, one of thanksgiving, one of completion. And so the key here is that rather than being in competition with one another, John and Jesus and their ministries are in a deep partnership. And that is the way they are really relating to one another. So although their disciples may have been caught up in a little bit of this tension, this rivalry, at times jealousy, not so for the Baptist and for Jesus themselves. They understood the nature of this partnership. And in fact, it's described as being so tight that they are in it together, and John's joy is dependent upon Jesus fulfilling his mission. And that is remarkable, because this not only tells us that John wasn't upset about being upstaged, it's telling us that his ministry was being validated, that its value was made clear because of the success of Jesus' ministry. Remember that John's ministry was one of preparation. and his role in preparing the soil and tilling the soil and getting it ready for the kingdom which was to come, his role was that of the preparer, and he was the forerunner to get the way ready for Jesus. He was to remind people of the need for change in their lives and help them be receptive to that change when it came about. And so that is the role that John had for himself. Now, verse 30, as we conclude the Baptist comments, this is fascinating. The Baptist says, he must become greater, I must become less. Now, what's interesting about these words that are used here for becoming greater and becoming lesser, these are words that are used to describe the light thrown off by the celestial bodies, by the sun, the moon, and the stars. And what I want you to think about is sunrise. And before sunrise, the stars dominate. But as the sun begins to come up and it increases, it looks like the light of the stars decreases. And that's the terminology here. That as the sun begins to rise, and we can call this the S-U-N or the S-O-N, in either case, as the sun begins to rise, the light from the stars goes into the background. Okay? And that is exactly what's happening in the text. That is exactly where we are, because these are the final direct words, the final direct quotations of the Baptist. These are the last things we're going to hear him say. And so as Jesus' ministry is beginning to shine and beginning to dominate the world, and particularly that of first century Palestine, as that is beginning to happen, the lights, the lesser lights, are fading into the background, and that includes the light of John the Baptist. Okay, and so that is a fascinating gives us a fascinating understanding of these words. When John said he must become greater because his light is coming to bear, and I must become less because his light is going to outshine mine. Okay, and that is the description that we rely upon here. Now, as we think about this and we think of the mission of the Baptist being fulfilled and being completed here, turn back with me once again. And I know we've gone through this before, but I want you to listen to the words of the prologue, because the prologue told us that this was all going to happen. So turn back to John chapter 1 and look at verses 4 through 6. Talking about Jesus, it says, "In him was life, and that life was the light of men." Okay, the light is coming. It's going to increase. "The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light, and the true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world." Okay? And so that is the description that we've seen of the role of John the Baptist from the beginning of the book, and now we see in chapter 3, particularly in verse 30, that this has been fulfilled, that the light of Christ is beginning to shine. The light of John the Baptist is fading into the background just as the sun is rising and the stars begin to vanish. Okay, next I want us to take a few minutes now and take a look at trying to dive into John's psyche a little bit, because I find his attitude remarkable, and it's an attitude that we don't see enough of in our world, nor in churches. But John the Baptist's attitude was remarkable, and here are a few examples. There's a phrase we use: he was willing to play second fiddle. Okay? And we all kind of know what that means, but think about what playing second fiddle involves. Second fiddle, of course, is a violin. And in an orchestra, you have a first violin section and a second violin section. And all of the notoriety, all of the glamour is in playing the first violin part. But you know what? The second violin part is just as important, even though you don't get your name in the headlights. And without that second fiddle part, the second violin part, the orchestra sounds shallow. Okay? What about trying to be, and this will date us a little bit, but what about playing the role of Ed McMahon to Johnny Carson for decades? You know, that's a secondary role that one just finds and relishes and is willing not to be the leader of attention themselves. What about the group that's the warm-up band? The main band is going to come on later, but here's the warm-up band that's to, you know, get the crowd ready, get the crowd excited and things. That's the role. And so, you know, it points out that John the Baptist, in looking at how he and Jesus were working together, he really appreciated the fact that they were working together, that they were partners, and that he was fully supporting the main mission. This then begs the question of us is, where are we in fitting in with the overall mission? Where do we find ourselves? Are we contributing? Or are we kind of sitting on the sidelines watching things happen? How do we view those people who are more gifted than us? Is there a hint of jealousy there? Is there a sense of great relaxation? They can take care of it. What about those who have more experience? You know, well, that's a job that needs to be done by somebody who's been around here a while, who knows the Lord better than I do, because I can't possibly step into that type of a responsibility. And so it leads us to ask some questions of ourselves. And I think collectively it forces us to ask this question, and that is simply, as a church, do we see ourselves functioning as a team? Is this idea of partnership really the way that we practice? Is it really the way that we live? Is it really the way that we minister? Okay, let that percolate for a little bit. But then individually, okay, if that's the question we need to ask of ourselves as a group, the question we need to ask ourselves as individuals is, am I a good teammate? And of course, the role of a teammate is to sometimes stay out of the way of our team members and let them handle something, but some of the responsibility is to step up and do what's necessary and important for us to take care of, right? And so those questions are all there, and I've written down a few tests, okay, that might help us understand whether we get this and whether we understand our role and the need for me to be productive in my role. Okay, first of all, here's one test. This test is, I would call, a relationship test. And the question is, when did you last consult a brother or sister about a spiritual matter? Whether it's your spiritual matter or their spiritual matter. When did you last offer, request, or just simply discuss a situation that needed some spiritual insight? This next question has to do with, are you contributing, okay? And are you contributing to the team? Not just are you in relationship with other members on the team, but the question, are you contributing to the team? What is your niche? What is your role in the group? Do you have one? What can you offer? And are you growing in that, or are you wilting? Because you don't just stay static. You're either growing or wilting. And Jesus talked about that over and over again when he compared growth in the kingdom to being like a plant. Okay? So are you in relationship? A meaningful spiritual relationship with others in the church? Are you contributing? Have you found your place in the church? And number 3 is the direction. And are you moving towards others in the family, or are you moving away from others in the family? Okay, and those things tell us a lot about how we feel as partners and how we feel as teammates. In today's world, I think this idea of being teammates, of being partners in the gospel is incredibly difficult. And it's been worsened by the isolation that we have experienced over the past almost year now, as we have had limited opportunities to gather together and simply be together. We as a society, and particularly I think this is exaggerated in modern America, we are so independently minded. Many of us are not willing to be part of something bigger. We're not willing to trust others. We do not possess a herd mentality. You think about the difficulties we have had organizing with respect to the health crisis that has been demonstrated over the past year. And if nothing else, we have shown that we are staunchly independent in our thinking through this. And that's a problem for us as Christians and as members of one another. It's a problem when we are not able to trust and rely upon one another. All of my personal beliefs and my personal silo that I live in is simply reinforced by all the technology that's around us. Social media, Facebook will continue to throw things at me that don't necessarily challenge where I'm at. It'll throw things at me that support where I'm at and make fun of everybody else. That's the nature of social media. That's how it's constructed, as basically an advertising forum, so that you will be presented with things largely that you agree with. And that's part of the reason that this silo can't talk to that silo. We have learned how to be totally independent from one another. Other media does the same. What we hear on the news, what we hear even in the weather, and all the talk programs and all the reality programs that are out there, they're all geared towards us looking and promoting where we currently are in our thinking and in our lifestyle. And it's a real challenge for a Christian to overcome this. I won't even talk about the political dialogue in today's world. I wrote down here political monologue, because that's literally what it is. One side's over here talking and heard only by themselves, and the other side's over here talking and is heard only by themselves. And it's a real difficult time for us when we see that the church is instructed to offer partnerships and to rely upon one another and trust one another. And it's hard for us to overcome the social inertia that exists all around us for that. There are very few experiences in today's world, and especially in this last year, that provide us with opportunities to break those silos down and overcome those silos. And I thought of a couple here. One was military life and military experience, which is only involves a minority of us, but nonetheless, one of the things that happens in military life is they see this idea of teamwork at a very, very high level, where one individual no longer thinks individually, but thinks in terms of the welfare of the group, and thinks in terms of supporting the group and what their role is within the group and in the context of the group, and how their actions impact the group. All of those questions challenge all of our military as they go through boot camp and those first, military experiences that they have. They have to break down all of the social silos that they have built around themselves, and they have to become fully dependent on one another. And there are some things in that our churches can learn from, that's for sure. Now, another example of that for many might be team sports, where you have been privileged to be part of something that's bigger than yourself, and you come to realize that you can only be part of this team successfully if everyone takes responsibility for their piece of the mission. A football team can't consist of just a quarterback. Neither can it consist just of an offensive line. You've got to have a defense, and you've got to have all those other pieces that can cause you to work together fluidly and smoothly and accomplish things that you could never accomplish as a group of individuals or a group of people who are just like you. It requires people to succeed because of the differences that exist. And that's a remarkable thing in today's society. Music or drama productions. We talked about the orchestra a few minutes ago. I've had a lot of musical experience, and my major experience over the years has been low brass playing, particularly trombone. And when I started my journey in music several decades ago, for me it was all about listening to trombone parts and thinking how important they were, and if I had a great written part, an important part in an orchestral piece, boy, that was fantastic. But you know what's happened as I've grown up and as I've matured? Now it's no longer about just the trombone part. I listen to the bassoons. I listen to the second violins and the violas, because that's where the fullness of the orchestra comes from, and that's where the beauty of the finished product, the beauty of the music, lies in everyone's contribution and everyone making it work. And that's where the beauty is. So I hope that you've had some of those types of experiences in your life where you can see the real value of teamwork, because that is it's rare in today's world, and it's not always valued as it should be. So I want us to spend a few minutes today. We're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Well, you know what? It's later than I thought. I'm going to pick up here next week. We're going to do a little bit of a sidebar, and we're going to talk about Paul's description of the body and how it's supposed to fit together and work in partnership and as a team. But we'll save that for next week. We'll pick up here, and next week we will finish the rest of these thoughts on John the Baptist and what we can learn from him. So, having said that, I trust that you are doing well, that you're gaining insight, that you're gaining a desire to serve the Lord, and that you will agree with me that God is good all the time.